Sanxian Island, 6 miles off the coast of China, 1552. In the east, the great kingdom sealed themselves off against the tide of European expansion that brought menacing strangers with their foreign god. In the west, European men of fortune prepared to pry their way into these new worlds with the tools of war, the mechanisms of commerce, and even, sadly, with the tenets of their Christian faith. This is the story of one man who adventured to these faraway lands for reasons few understood, who traveled not with a battalion or a bill of trade, but with a simple message of invitation and grace. This is the story of a missionary who died alone on a desolate island within sight of the land of his life's dream, unaware that he had forever changed the face and the race of Christianity. This is Francis Xavier. Francis Xavier, the man who came to be known as the Apostle to the East and hailed as the greatest missionary since the time of Christ's own apostles, began life in the backwater kingdom of Navarre in northern Spain. The 16th century brought a wave of excitement to Europe as explorers crisscrossed the shrinking globe and artists created with a passion unrivaled since antiquity. But the boy Francis knew none of it. He was born in 1506 to parents who, like rural Navarre itself, persisted in the well-worn ways of an older era.
Francis was the product of a feudalistic society, a society with roots in the Middle Ages, part of a very old and very noble household, and he had every opportunity open to him that someone of his class would have had at the time.
His father served in the king's court. His sister entered a convent, and his older brothers took up the swords of chivalry. It was a typical late medieval family.
The Xavier family was a noble family, an important family of the Kingdom of Navarre, and Francis grew up in a noble household with a noble education, and he would have been expected to become, of course, a nobleman and a knight himself.
But as Spain consolidated into an empire under King Ferdinand, the tiny outlying kingdom of Navarre, and the Xaviers along with it, were increasingly left out of imperial politics. Then the Xavier family endured a barrage of staggering calamities. When Francis was 9 years old, his father died, leaving the family helpless and at the mercy of the aggrieved Spanish king.
Now, tragedy comes upon tragedy, and next year, not even 1 year after the death of his father, soldiers are coming to destroy the castle, to knock down that beautiful tower as a punishment for his brothers having fought against the King of Spain.
After Spanish troops imprisoned Francis' brothers, Francis and his mother eked out a living among the castle's ruins, and the highborn boy found himself cutting logs down the river at the family mill. The lords of Navarre were passing away with the rest of medieval society. But old ways die hard. The youngest sons of medieval families typically served the church as a priest or a monk. So Francis left his family, left the mill, his brothers, and what was left of the castle to study for the priesthood.
Early on, Xavier decided on a clerical career, not so much, it seems, because of special sense of vocation, but it's an honorable job, and he could have a benefice and lead a fairly nice, respectable life.
A post in the church would bring much-needed stability to the Xaviers. After ordination, Francis would return to Navarre and collect a nice salary. It was a plum job and the fast track towards recapturing some of the family's former prestige and honor and wealth, especially if he were to become a bishop, an archbishop, or a cardinal, a prince of the church.
And he could go hunting, go fishing, do whatever he wanted to do. If he were devout, he could also perform some priestly duties as it pleased him.
So in 1525, the 19-year-old Francis left home for college. In Paris, he would take a course of theology and philosophy in preparation for the priesthood. He'd also get a taste of all that Europe's most cosmopolitan city could offer.
As minor nobility from Navarre, which is not really in the center of the universe in Xavier's time, probably his going off to university is to put him more in the center of culture, probably to give him some kind of a genteel veneer so that he won't look as if he's come from the provinces. Should he have to go back home, at least he'll talk like somebody who's been to the big city, and he'll be able to drop the kinds of learned references that the gentleman would have to drop in order to be a gentleman.
Paris was one of the largest cities in the world and a magnet for all manner of interesting people. John Calvin, Erasmus, and Leonardo da Vinci all walked the congested streets of its famous Latin Quarter.
The University of Paris in the 16th century was still the most prestigious academic institution in the Western world. It would compare today with Cambridge University, with Oxford University, with Harvard University, with Princeton University, and maybe all of those rolled into one.
The University of Paris was the brain of Western culture, and there Francis joined his peers from all over Europe at the Collège de Saint-Barbe.
Paris was not a classical university. It was a scholastic university with what would have been seen as a very old-fashioned training by Xavier's time. It's an old-fashioned training, but it's a rigorous training. So he learned to read a lot had he studied. It's not clear that he was always a model student.
By all accounts, Francis was a medieval frat boy. He made fast friends with a group of students and teachers notorious for their hard drinking, womanizing, and generally running amok. He was the best high jumper in Paris. More than once, he scaled over the college walls to partake of the seamy Parisian nightlife, breaking a strictly enforced curfew. And like so many college students after him, Francis squandered his allowance and then wrote home for a bailout.
My lord, your grace feels no less keenly my miseries and scholastic toils than I do myself here in Paris, where I am ever lacking what I need. When you become aware of my grievous plight, surely your great generosity will bring an end to my miseries, alleviating my great poverty. Humbly yours, Francisco.
Relying mainly on native talent, Francis survived the rigors of college life and earned a degree. Soon it would be time to return to sleepy Navarre for ordination to the priesthood. Xavier and his pious roommate, Peter Faber, both 24, made way for a new and unusual student. A 38-year-old Hidalgo turned beggar, recently kicked out of his own digs because of his reckless ministry to plague victims. To make matters worse, the new boarder was a Spaniard who had fought on the victorious side of the same war that had ruined the Xaviers. His name was Ignatius.
Ignatius Loyola, like Xavier, was a member of minor nobility, his family. Again, high-standing people, minor nobility, but still moved in the highest circles in Spain. He had the usual training of people of his class, that is to say, he could read Spanish, read Castilian. He knew how to dance, he knew how to sword fight. That was about it.
After his military career was cut short by a nearly fatal injury from a cannonball, Ignatius underwent a radical conversion. He renounced his wealth and nobility and then begged door to door, preached in the streets, and guided people through an ordeal he called the spiritual exercises. He came to Paris not to advance a career, but simply to gain the academic credentials needed to avoid the Inquisition. With Luther's break from the fold still dividing Europe, Catholic Paris hunkered down to a siege mentality. The charismatic upstart Ignatius would have to prove his orthodoxy to church authorities. The fact that he was quickly attracting disciples made him all the more suspicious.
In Paris, these men gathered around Ignatius, attracted to him by his personality. Somehow or other, he had this great gift of winning deep devotion on the part of many of those with whom he came into contact.
3 of the university's best students took his mysterious spiritual exercises, then promptly dropped out of school and gave up their patrimony to live and work at a charity hospital. The Parisian establishment was scandalized. They notified the local Inquisition and then dragged the 3 back to school. Xavier's roommate, Faber, also made the spiritual exercises and emerged a changed man. But Francis was less than enthusiastic.
Francis, who came from this very important noble family, considered Ignatius a little bit beneath his level, I think both in terms of breeding and of education. And he was not that friendly towards Ignatius at the beginning.
Francis kept his distance from Ignatius and his band of devoted do-gooders. Athletic feats and nighttime sorties over the school wall proved more captivating than daily masses and penniless destitution. But all that quickly changed. A drinking buddy of Xavier's crowd was hanged to death on the gallows for killing a man in a fight, his 3rd offense. A professor and close friend contracted syphilis during one of their midnight romps and died an excruciating death. Then Francis ran out of money again. Desperate and desolate, he turned to the last resort. Ignatius helped Francis with a little money and then set to work on tougher problems.
It's not clear exactly what they talked about in religious conversation, but we can surmise that it was about how God was acting in their lives, the kinds of inspirations that they felt, what encouraged them, what they found devotion in. I think it was topics like this, very, very personal. It was not abstract theology.
Xavier began to trust Ignatius and even experienced the spiritual exercises firsthand. The exercises, a month-long silent retreat of meditations on the life of Christ, sprang from Ignatius' own experience of conversion, which led him from the brink of suicidal despair to unwavering confidence in God's love and a generosity to serve the neediest of God's people. Ignatius authored the exercises as a spiritual how-to manual for those seeking a similar experience. He combined a traditional medieval piety with the recently rediscovered art of classical rhetoric.
The traditional art of memory allowed you to memorize your speech that you're going to give in a law court or your speech that you're going to give on the political stage. And what Ignatius does is take the art of memory and say, you're back under the cross with Jesus there. You're down in hell, feeling the flames licking on you.
Through the exercise of the imagination and memory, Ignatius thought the individual could come into direct contact with God's will, a proposition that to some Catholic officials smacked of Protestant individualism. But his tangles with the Inquisition only made Ignatius more intriguing.
And you can see how a bored student would think this is a lot more interesting than anything I'm getting in class. And you can see the whole story right there. Xavier's a restless kid who's always been too big for where he lived. He finally gets out to the big city. He gets in this stultifying environment, and then he sees a way out.
Ignatius and his exercises had rescued Xavier from the self-serving path back to medieval Navarre, a flowery title and comfortable boredom. Francis admitted that he owed Ignatius his very life.
And one of the really important things, I think, to understand Xavier is to understand his friendship with Ignatius, a friendship which never left him.
I don't know how I can ever repay Master Ignatius. He is the reason I no longer associate with those who are filled with lies and heresies. He's a tremendous help, such a great man of God.
Ignatius and his band of friends, Xavier among them, joined in a mission to save souls. They vowed eternal poverty and chastity, then resolved to make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem to visit the holy places of Jesus' life and convert the Muslims in possession of the Holy Land. In 1537, the Parisian scholars, dressed in beggars' clothes, set their eyes on the distant shores of Palestine.
And that was the great turning point in his life. And so Francis Xavier, the dashing, almost ne'er-do-well Hidalgo, started on his road to be Saint Francis Xavier, the great hero, especially in the Far East.
The perennial war with the Turks in the east prevented Xavier and company from going further than Venice. So they turned to Rome, the center of Western Christianity. In Rome, they found a glorious canvas of classical beauty, a city built and colored by Raphael, Bramante, and Michelangelo. They also found a church crippled with decadence.
They came at the time of the pontificate of Pope Paul III, Alessandro Farnese, who came from a wealthy old Italian family, was in some ways considered the last of the Renaissance popes. He had fathered, 4 or 5 children as a cardinal, was a serious prelate, but again, liked the high life.
By the 1530s, he's plenty old. And because he's older, he's beginning to think about church reform the way everybody else is. He's an interesting combination, therefore, of really old-fashioned decadence and new-fashioned spiritual reform.
The Pope enjoyed Ignatius and his Paris-trained scholars. Their simple lifestyle and infectious enthusiasm impressed the aging pontiff. He gave the group his blessing and made them an official order within the Catholic Church. They called themselves the Company of Jesus. After they were ordained as priests, they worked in the streets of Rome, searching out people who were most in need.
They were hearing some confessions. They were doing street preaching. Most striking is how much time they spent in what we would call social ministries, and really very humble ones. I mean, working in hospitals, especially hospitals of the so-called incurables, the syphilitics, a despised segment of the population.
The young company, better known as the Jesuits, stirred the souls of 16th century Rome and transformed the way Europeans thought about God, educated their children, and even the way they prayed. Word of the new order reached all quarters of Europe. Many bishops and kings petitioned the Pope for Jesuits, and he dispersed them all over the New World alongside Europe's most noted explorers.
For the early society, mission was a key element of its foundation. The Jesuits, a small group at the very beginning, were ready to be dispersed and sent anywhere that the Pope would send them.
But someone had to stay behind and run the multinational company. So Ignatius kept Xavier in Rome. Xavier, who had once craved clerical honors, found himself behind a desk pushing pencils. His task, to read and answer reports from Jesuits whom Ignatius had sent to all corners of the globe. But Xavier wasn't trapped at his desk for long. The King of Portugal wanted Jesuits to staff his budding mission in India. Ignatius agreed to send 2 men, but illness rendered one of them unable to endure the journey to India. With no other men available, Xavier was the only man left.
So Ignatius turned to him. Francis, it seems this is your enterprise. And according to the tradition, the answer of Francis was, Sus, aquí estoy. Here I am. Come on, let's go.
Lisbon, 1540. Xavier arrived in a Portugal that, along with Spain, led the European age of exploration. Under the able rule of King John III, Portugal's empire stretched eastward from Brazil to Indonesia. While Spanish fleets headed west, the Portuguese sailed to the east.
Europeans knew very little about Asia at this time. Asia was part of Roman history. It was written up by the ancient Greeks like Ptolemy. But it was seen as a kind of exotic other and nothing more. People had lots of very extravagant stories about unicorns and Amazon women and strange mythical beasts, but people really had virtually no direct contact with Asia.
Despite Marco Polo's 13th century trip to Asia, by Xavier's time, Europe had retained precious little concrete information about the continent. Europe's imagination ran wild. One popular medieval legend held that a Christian king named Prester John lived isolated in the Far East, but stood ready to join European Christendom in its war against the Muslims.
I think Prester John was a myth that just wouldn't go away. I think even Francis Xavier believed in his heart of hearts that there was some kind of Christian king who lived in Asia and perhaps in Africa that was ready to join forces with Catholicism.
What was on the mind and heart of Xavier on the eve of his departure from Europe? Perhaps he dreamt of joining forces with Prester John and seeing a unified worldwide Christianity. Perhaps he dreamt of strange races and exotic creatures. He most certainly did not know that he stood as a principal actor in a plot that would shape the next 5 centuries of world history. Europe's rapid outward expansion, the rise of modernity, and the collapse of Christendom itself. Beyond a doubt, Xavier knew he was leaving and would never see his home or his companions again.
Ignatius, we leave this week for the Indies. I don't know if we shall ever see each other again, but I pray one day I will see us joined together in the next life, united in Christ's glory.
In April 1541, with a teeming imagination, Xavier left Europe in a caravan of ships from Lisbon. The voyage represented a continuation of the spiritual impetus he first felt in Paris, and he was off with the same good news for whatever world he would meet.
The trip from Lisbon to Goa would have been absolutely horrific. You can't exaggerate the terrible conditions on those ships, with disease, lack of appropriate food, danger from pirates, danger from storms. It was a dangerous time. The Islamic trade network was not very happy about Portugal poaching on its territory, so there was always a constant risk of attack from Islamic ships. So it was no picnic. It was really quite a terrible voyage, and it lasted for months.
I was was seasick for 2 months because of the oppressive heat and the lack of winds. I would write at greater length, but my illness prevents me. I have been bled for the 7th time today. I'm feeling only fairly well. May God be praised.
Of the 5 galleons to begin the journey from Lisbon, only 2 reached Goa, a remarkable success by 16th century standards.
When he got there, he found churches, he found missions underway, and even plans to found the university that became the College of St. Paul. So when he got there, it was a little European city.
In 1510, when the Portuguese conquered Goa, they found the locals practicing a mixture of Hinduism and Islam. By the time Xavier arrived 3 decades later, the Portuguese Christians had displaced these natives into outlying areas in order to make room for their trading venture. Like the church in Europe, Goa's Christian community desperately needed renewal. The Portuguese colonists, sailors, soldiers, and traders were living notoriously dissolute lives, and the clergy were not doing much better. King John, with the blessings of the Pope, had sent Xavier to whip them into shape.
King John was very unhappy about the way the church was being administered and organized in the East. He was aware that a good job was not being done in India.
Xavier carried 2 documents that announced him, in effect, as the most powerful European in the East. The first appointed him special legate of King John. The second made him the Pope's select ambassador. He promptly presented himself to the Bishop of Goa, the Patriarch of India.
He told the Patriarch, I will never use either document unless first you give me permission. As a matter of fact, he was above the Patriarch, but he made very clear that nobody is going to know about it.
Xavier declined the comfortable quarters due to him at the bishop's palace in favor of the local hospital for the incurables.
He started looking after the patients, the inmates of the hospital. He treated them, he washed them, he looked after their wounds.
He would visit the sick in the hospitals, and that impressed a lot to see an European washing the wounds of the local sick people.
As Xavier tended to the needs of the poorest of the Indian Christians, he discovered that they had been subjected to a drive-through baptism and then simply left to the devices of the corrupt colonial powers. After seeing the extent of the need, he devised a plan to educate those already baptized and to convert those not yet received into the faith.
He did not know the language, but I think he had a way of communicating. Now, how he communicated is really a marvel.
He brought some pictures, holy pictures like the Virgin Mary. He would set up on a street corner with these pictures behind him. He would have his translators with him, and he would attract mostly children, but people on the street, by singing very simple jingles.
His creativity was this. He knew that the local people loved music. So his contribution was to be able to put the entire religious instruction into a simple musical raga, we call it, which the people could easily repeat. People were going back home, and on the way they were still singing all this because this was the music they loved.
The Portuguese have simply not done this. There's been no attempt to translate Christianity into any Indian language.
Xavier trekked from village to village sharing the Christian message. Legend holds he baptized tens of thousands of people, often thousands at the same time.
He was operating in an area in South India where it was natural and normal and real for groups to make group decisions. Therefore, of course, he did baptize large numbers of people. We're talking about a village group perhaps of maybe 400 people who would seek baptism as a community. And that's the kind of instant he was involved in.
Because of the many people in need, my arms are exhausted from baptizing, and I can no longer speak after reciting the creed and the commandments in their language so many times.
After 3 years in India, Xavier enjoyed many successes. He fell deeply in love with the people he encountered, and leaving one village for the next was never easy.
When I was leaving, in order to avoid the tears and weeping of my friends, both men and women, I embarked around midnight. But even so, I was unable to avoid them since I could not hide from them.
Despite the successes, the work was grueling, the climate severe, the culture mystifying. Worse than any material hardship was Xavier's acute longing for his original companions, especially for Ignatius.
Ignatius, may the grace and love of Christ our Lord be with us forever. During all this time, I have received only one letter from you. I know well that you write to me each year. I too write you every year, but I fear that just as I do not get your letters, so you do not receive mine.
Given so many natural and inevitable difficulties, Xavier was shocked to discover what he considered the greatest obstacle of all to his mission: the Portuguese themselves.
It was not long before he realized that the Portuguese who were there, they were a discredit to Christianity. Most of them only had greed, luxury, and then lust, all the possible vices.
He becomes increasingly disillusioned with the Portuguese in India. In fact, he sees them as threatening the continuance of the church.
The clergy were more interested in doing trade and business, which would earn them money, in the hope that after some years they would be able to go back to Portugal with all that they had collected and live a luxurious life.
Xavier's job was straightforward, if not impossible: clean up the Portuguese colony and get the church there to follow its own rules. But Xavier showed little interest in directly fulfilling his office as moral reformer. He could not be bothered by lukewarm colonists when faced with so many who had never even heard the gospel.
He was given a particular administrative job and he simply walked away from it. He was on fire with evangelism, and he wasn't going to get involved in political, ecclesiastical, and secular politics.
Xavier had gone to India to be an evangelist, and he was very critical of those would-be evangelists back home who treated the gospel simply as an academic exercise.
Many fail to become Christians in India because they have no one to teach them true faith. I am seized with the thought of going to schools in Europe, especially the University of Paris, and screaming like a madman, how many souls fail to go to glory and go instead to hell because of your neglect? I fear that many at the university study more to obtain honors than to adapt themselves to the demands of those honors.
The Portuguese colonists were not the only matter of consternation. Xavier noticed that whole segments of the Indian population seemed cool to his message, and worse, repulsed by his person. Xavier, himself an upper-crust son, was unable to make headway among India's own aristocracy, the Brahmins.
They are the upper caste Hindus. They are the priestly caste. They are the intellectual caste. And they were the ones who controlled the bureaucracy.
Xavier either ignored or misunderstood the dynamics of the Hindu caste system.
Back in Europe, aristocracy was extraordinarily powerful, but a poor boy, if he became a priest and a brilliant teacher, and then eventually could become archbishop, where he was level with the highest prince. An impossibility. There's no equivalent to that within Hindu society. Brahmins are Brahmins, warriors are warriors, the outcasts are the outcasts, and never shall they change. It looks like a stratified European society, but it's not.
The concern Xavier showed for the poor prevented him from converting the Brahmins.
Francis, to the astonishment, I think, of the outcasts, was identifying with them. He was in, as it were, the street and the gutter with them. If you're mixing with outcasts, you simply can't even be close to physically a Brahmin. In a sense, he had cut himself off from being able to interact with them because of his constant physical touching of non-caste people.
Xavier's refusal to deal realistically with the caste system and his ambivalence toward the Portuguese led him to despair over India. He left the country and for 2 years traveled all over southern Asia, perhaps still hoping to find Prester John, the fabled Christian king of the East. His journeys took him to the booming city of Malacca, a crossroads where sailors from all over the Far East and the Islamic world met. And in Malacca, he met for the first time people who claimed to be from a large nation of wise and civil lords.
He suddenly hears about this sophisticated kingdom with a courtly and knightly structure that is so like late medieval Spain as to be, really quite bewildering in its similarities, with a great knightly caste and great princes.
Xavier met a young sailor named Anhiro. Under Xavier's guidance, Anhiro became Christian. He regaled Xavier with stories about his homeland, the land called Cipango by Marco Polo, now known as Japan.
It was in seeing these Japanese sailors and recognizing that they come from a very high civilization with a very strong sense of politesse, and they're very educated people, that really made him want to go to Japan.
Anhiro told Xavier that if he spoke well and replied satisfactorily to their questions and lived beyond reproach, within half a year the king and nobility and all the other prudent people in the land would become Christians. Xavier immediately wanted to go to Japan, but administrative duties beckoned him back to Goa. Xavier had been gone from Goan headquarters for over 3 years, and he returned to find the colonial government in even worse dissipation than when he had left it. Xavier threatened the king with fire and brimstone if he did not replace the province governor.
To King John III. Your Highness will encounter something new at the hour of death. You will see yourself deprived of all your kingdoms and lordships and enter a place where you will be given orders and, God forbid, be excluded from paradise.
Countless tasks piled up in Goa as Xavier deliberated over the decision to go to Japan. As more Jesuits arrived in India, he was responsible for directing their work and their lives. If he went to Japan, it seemed the Church's interest in India would languish. He had, after all, been sent to India by order of the King and the Pope. Many advisors urged him to remain.
They write even to the King of Portugal telling him, Father Francis is making a big mistake. Why he's doing this when he's much needed here in India? What is he doing? So it was opposed by everybody.
King John doesn't know about Japan, neither does the Pope. This is really new stuff he's getting into at this point.
For 3 months, Xavier agonized over the decision to leave India for Japan. Was this God's will, or merely egocentric wanderlust?
His ordinary work is prayer and prayer and prayer, asking the Lord to let him know his will.
Quite simply, Xavier determined that he could be of more help to more souls in Japan than in India. So he remained in Goa only long enough to read the mail from Rome and assign new Jesuits to missions throughout Asia. Then he hot-footed it to Japan.
There could probably not have been a worse time to arrive in a country. Japan was in a state of total civil war, divided into over 60 small kingdoms with feudal lords fighting among each other. And certainly this was no time for a Westerner to come in and to try to meet with people.
Europeans had happened upon Japan only 6 years earlier, when a lone Portuguese ship was blown off course during a storm. When Xavier arrived, no Westerner had ever ventured inland beyond one or two of the country's ports. The Japanese, still wary of the bearded riffraff who washed up occasionally on their southern shores, called the Europeans the Southern Barbarians. Xavier brought the Japanese convert Anhiro along with him to help translate and to win his entry into the country. They entered in the south of the country disguised in a Chinese pirate junk, and then traveled to Yamaguchi, Anhiro's native town, where the local lord graciously allowed them to stay. Xavier and Anhiro began teaching the Christian faith using the same techniques Xavier had pioneered throughout India and Indonesia. He lived with the poor people, clothed in a threadbare cassock and shoeless. But in the larger cities, Xavier and Anhiro encountered resistance from the monks, nobles, and intellectuals, whose support would be necessary if they were to convert the masses.
And they would stand on the street corners and they would preach, and they were dressed in these very, very poor robes, like simple monks. And of course, the people in Yamaguchi thought that these people were very strange. And some of them would laugh at them, jeer at them. Some of them would throw things at them, throw stones at them when they were preaching.
On Anhiro's advice, Xavier set out on a mission to see the Emperor of Japan, whom he would beg for permission to preach the gospel throughout the entire dominion. Xavier nurtured the secret hope of gaining the Emperor's own conversion. The journey to the imperial city of Kyoto was long and hard.
It was during winter. They had to go always through the snow. Very, very hostile villages who had never seen a foreigner. And the children not only insulting but throwing stones at them. They had to cross frozen rivers. So it was a horrible, horrible, horrible journey.
Upon arriving in Kyoto, Xavier waited in line for days to see the emperor, the man he hoped would serve as a sort of Asian Constantine. But he soon learned the truth about the so-called emperor.
The emperor ruled in name only. He held no power outside of Kyoto itself. He was merely a figurehead.
At this point, Xavier's failure seemed complete. He couldn't learn the language. He had made little headway with the learned Japanese, and he had taken a futile trip to see a puppet emperor. His dream was vanishing. He retreated to the south, perhaps to get on a boat and return to India, or even to return home. On his way, Xavier had an epiphany that would forever change his life, his church, and the world.
He makes a decisive change in his whole procedure. He now gets the best clothes that he has. I'm not sure they were all that elaborate, but they were certainly not a beggar's clothes. And now he calls himself an ambassador and emphasizes his aristocratic background.
Xavier realized that his old method, traveling as a poor, humble beggar, living amongst the poorest of the poor, was not the best way to spread Christianity and a culture as refined as the Japanese.
When Xavier returned to Yamaguchi from Kyoto, he took off his humble robes of a monk, put on his vice-regal insignia and his best cape, and went back to the palace of the Lord of Yamaguchi.
We gave the Duke of Yamaguchi some letters which we had brought from the governor and the bishop, and also some gifts as a token of our friendship. We wanted to preach the law of God in his land. He very graciously granted us permission and then ordered placards to be set up in the streets stating he was pleased with our preaching.
He decided everything must be in Japanese, and we must behave as Japanese, and we must conform to Japanese ways of behaving. Now, he didn't talk like that in India.
Xavier began talking about non-religious subjects. He slowed down and got to know the Japanese. He introduced them to Western math, science, and geography. They even talked about the weather.
They did not know that the world was round, nor did they know the course of the sun. They asked about comets, lightning, rain, and snow, and similar phenomena. They were very satisfied with our replies and explanations.
Francis wanted to ask what people thought. Francis wanted to talk to people. And for Francis, conversation always preceded conversion.
Becoming less strange to the Japanese facilitated the exchange of ideas, and ultimately the idea of Xavier's God, but now in terms that would be more congenial to the Japanese. Xavier even began referring to Buddhist writings as scriptures, a word Europeans had previously employed only for the Bible.
He even starts trying to accommodate the Christian message to Japanese language. He seeks specifically Japanese Buddhist words to describe God, heaven, the angels, and so on. Now he's translating much more fundamentally. He's getting inside Japanese culture and life.
His new method met with an unprecedented success.
Many of those who became Christian were nobles, and after they had become Christians, they were such great friends of ours that I could never end writing about it.
Many European missionaries had equated Christianity with Western Europe. To be Christian was to appreciate European art, literature, and law. Conversion had meant becoming European.
When St. Francis went to India, he was simply part of the classic expansion of Christendom. There was no sense of the church expanding apart from the authority of the Christian European culture. When he gets to Japan, he makes a decisive break with enormous importance, both for the Society of Jesus, but also for Christian mission, that you can be Christian outside European culture, and there can be a Christian culture that isn't a European culture. Japan was not the expansion of Christendom. Japan was Christianity trying to become Japanese.
Xavier was the architect of a notion that is now commonplace, that there could be authentic non-European Christians. But for Francis Xavier, Japan was not enough. With the country in civil strife, a widespread conversion was impossible. And there was still no Prester John. Thanks to his contact in Japan with a number of learned monks, Xavier heard of another, more ancient country.
He found out from the Japanese that there was this other country, this other culture, the Chinese, which the Japanese themselves revered.
And so yet another dream took shape. Xavier set his eyes to the headwaters of Asian culture, to China.
China is the great Middle Kingdom. China is a celestial empire. So what you learn in Japan makes you even more eager to get to China.
And so Xavier thought to himself, if China has such an influence on Japanese culture and on Japanese religion and Japanese literature, then I need to go to China, and I need to convince the Chinese emperor to let me preach the faith there. Because if the Chinese accept Christianity, then the Japanese will follow.
In comparison to China, Japan seemed like an open house. Unwelcome visitors, Westerners in particular, were imprisoned, tortured, and often executed.
The Chinese had no desire for contact with Europe beyond very basic trade contacts. They certainly had no desire for a Christian mission.
August 1552. Xavier landed on the tiny island of Sancion within sight of the Chinese mainland. From there, Portuguese merchants trafficked with Chinese pirates. Xavier scrambled to get to China by any means possible. He begged, he bribed, he threatened, but no one was willing to risk certain death if caught. Days passed, then weeks, then months.
After our arrival in Sancian, I was sick for 15 days. I have now recovered my health. I don't know anything more to tell you from here except that we are firmly resolved to go to China.
With the coming of winter, most of the Portuguese fleet fled for India. All of Xavier's companions deserted him, except for one Chinese translator, Anthony, who had been gone from China for so long that he forgot the language. Eventually, Xavier found a Chinese merchant willing to ferry him across to Canton in exchange for nearly 2 tons of pepper, a small fortune.
8 days from now, I am expecting a merchant who is to take me to Canton. It is most certain if he does not die, he will come here because of the great profit that he will make from the pepper I am giving him.
The day of the rendezvous came and went. Xavier kept watch from his desolate beachside hut, waking day after day to an empty horizon. On the island itself, he ministered to sick merchantmen left behind to die. On a cold November morning, after saying a funeral mass for a Portuguese trader, Xavier returned to his lean-to and came down with a fever. He was bled several times. For a week, Xavier passed in and out of consciousness while Anthony scrounged for food. The remaining ships weighed anchor for India, and according to legend, left the 2 men with only a handful of almonds between them. December 3rd, 1552. Stuck between 2 nowheres, the failing missions behind him and the unknown potential before him, Xavier died. Although the story of European exploration often tells of tragic misunderstandings and murderous ignorance, Xavier's is a different story.
Xavier conceived his vocation as a pioneer to open the doors so that others could come in.
His life work was to go as an explorer and scout out what was possible. To do surveillance, basically, and see what the stage was for future Jesuit work.
Ambivalently accepted in life, Xavier was everywhere welcomed in death. On the journey back to Goa, Francis' corpse was widely honored as it retraced his missionary steps from island to island. In Goa, one adoring visitor went so far as to bite off Xavier's big toe to keep as a relic. Miracles were ascribed to his intercession almost immediately. Europeans voraciously read his letters, which contained the best information on Asia to reach Europe since Marco Polo.
What was Xavier's legacy? And I think that we see in the later missionaries this desire to engage the cultures with which they come into contact, and through that to touch the hearts of the people of those places.
Today, 500 years later, Xavier's popularity has only intensified. Millions of Indians, Hindus, Muslims and Christians alike make frequent pilgrimage to Goa to pay tribute to the man they revere as a saint. Throughout the world, churches, high schools, universities bear his name. In the United States, the name appears in the most diverse of circumstances: Xavier University. And even Charles Francis Xavier, Professor X of the fictional X-Men. Jesuit missionaries eventually fulfilled Xavier's dream of reaching the Chinese emperor, with whom they initiated a cultural exchange between East and West that had no precedent then and perhaps no rival now. Within 50 years of Xavier's death, Jesuits were serving as China's foremost mathematicians, linguists, and geographers. Rather than a quest for world domination, Xavier's mission was an expansion of the heart, an opening of the mind, a discovery of love.
Whoever wishes to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for me will find it. These words of Jesus are easy to understand, but at the moment of death, their meaning becomes obscure. And no matter how learned you may be, you will only understand when God reveals the meaning in His infinite mercy. Entirely yours, Francisco.
Thank you.